Wait! Wait! No! That's not right! Everything he's saying is a lie! Believe me! The mother-in-law I had come to care for passed away after a long illness. Today was her funeral. I wanted to send her off quietly, but it seems my wish won't be fulfilled. All because of my foolish husband standing in front of me. I took a deep breath and said to my husband, "Go to hell!" My name is Tiffany, a 40-year-old housewife. I met my husband Daniel through a friend when I was 30. We've been married for 10 years, but we don't have any children. 2 years into our marriage, we found out that I had difficulty conceiving. Because of this, I once suggested divorce to my husband. I don't care if we don't have kids. My desire to be with you won't change. Those words meant the world to me. My husband's family consisted of mother-in-law Ellen and brother-in-law David, who was 2 years older than my husband. I heard that the father-in-law had died in an accident when my husband was in middle school. After father-in-law's death, mother-in-law raised my husband and brother-in-law by herself. The first time we met, she expressed her relief. I'm at ease now, knowing Daniel's with someone dependable. Back in the day, he was quite the handful. She told me, and it was a comforting thing to hear. On our way home from my husband's childhood home, I asked with a laugh, "Was Daniel really a handful?" "Not at all. It was David who was the wild one. I was much better behaved." True to his word, brother-in-law is wild. Or rather, at his age, such words don't fit him anymore. To put it badly, he's a good-for-nothing. And I despise this brother-in-law. Of course, there's a reason for that. Brother-in-law lives with mother-in-law in the family home, but he hardly ever comes home. It seems he hops from friend's house to friend's house, and the only reason he comes back is for one thing. "Mom, can you lend me some money? $300. No, $200 will do." He demands money from mother-in-law, and when he runs out, he returns home, over 30 years old, without a steady job, living off day labor and part-time work. Additionally, he seems to have a liking for gambling, always complaining, I have no money." The first time we met, brother-in-law was quite rude to me. When he heard about where I worked, he pulled out his mobile phone, and after looking it up, said, "Wow, decent salary, huh? Daniel, you found yourself a good one." With a sleazy laugh. I could only offer a wry smile, and nearby, mother-in-law scolded. "How dare you be so rude to someone you've just met? Go away." Afterward, both mother-in-law and my husband apologized profusely. I guess they both have their troubles with brother-in-law. That was my impression. By the way, brother-in-law is also quite disliked by my parents. At a family dinner, despite the fact that my husband and I were paying, he said, "Free food and free booze. Don't mind me," and helped himself to beer more times than I could count. "Enough!" Mother-in-law shouted, but he didn't listen, leaving my parents and me smiling through gritted teeth. Of course, the bill was astronomical. Mother-in-law insisted on paying their part, but given the situation, my husband and I refused. Friends and family have often expressed concern, suggesting I reconsider the marriage. But my feelings never wavered. I was very fond of my husband Daniel, and while I thought the worst of brother-in-law, mother-in-law was a very kind person. This decision would be one I'd only half regret years later. After we got married, peaceful days followed. Even without children, the time spent with my husband made me very happy. Brother-in-law was still the same, but at that time, he hadn't yet started asking us for money or causing trouble. But then, something happened that would disrupt our lives. "Tiffany, Mom's collapsed! The hospital just called." My husband seemed terribly shaken. I calmed him over the phone and rushed to the hospital. After hearing the explanation from the doctor, we were both stunned. Mother-in-law had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, resulting in paralysis on the left side of her body. Additionally, a checkup revealed endometrial cancer. After the surgery and chemotherapy, we'll monitor her progress. As for the paralysis, with rehabilitation, well, please understand that returning to her former life will be difficult, said the doctor. We could only quietly accept his words. It was our 5th year of marriage. Mother-in-law was hospitalized for a few months before being discharged. She worked hard at rehabilitation, and her speech recovered to almost the same level as before. However, paralysis remained in her left hand and foot. It was, of course, difficult for mother-in-law to continue working, though she quit her job. Even while battling her illness, mother-in-law tried not to worry us and acted as cheerful as before. Look at this! Chemotherapy really does make your hair fall out. My head's all smooth now. Mother-in-law laughed, but before her collapse, she had beautiful long hair. Ellen's hair was so glossy and pretty. To my comment, she replied, "Well, thank you. Hair is a woman's life." She used to say that about her hair. It was her pride. She must be feeling down inside. After mother-in-law was discharged, my husband and I faced a problem. Of course, it was about mother-in-law. So, about Ellen. Do you think David will help out? My question was met with a deep sigh from my husband. No, that's just it. I was speechless at his story. Despite mother-in-law's fall, brother-in-law didn't show up at the hospital right away. He appeared on the day of mother-in-law's surgery. If you thought he came out of concern to see how she was, you'd be wrong. Long time no see, Mom. Feeling good? Hey, sorry to ask, but can you lend me about $500, please? Mother-in-law was so dumbfounded by this that she was lost for words. A nurse nearby said, "Your mother is about to have surgery. Please don't excite the patient before an operation." That's what she was reportedly told. Of course, it's far too disrespectful to mother-in-law. However, brother-in-law, slightly irritated by the nurse's words, said, "Hey, it's none of your business, right? It's a family matter, so shut it." Mother-in-law was furious and said, "Go away! I don't even want to see your face." After handing him some money from her wallet, I heard brother-in-law left happily. What the? That's unbelievable! Such disrespect to Ellen. Just hearing the story made me shake with anger. I've contacted David, but he's the worst, really. He said he'd leave it to us, and then he became unreachable. I had always thought brother-in-law was the worst, but this was beyond belief. I had a headache. Which is why, Tiffany, I have a favor to ask. Can we live with my parents? I want to take care of Mom. Of course, I'll help too. He said, if mother-in-law had been a difficult person and we didn't get along, honestly, I might have hesitated to live together. However, the mother-in-law I knew was always cheerful and kind, treating me like her own daughter. I was anxious about supporting mother-in-law with no caregiving knowledge, but I had no doubts about my husband's request. So we decided to live with my husband's parents. But caregiving was more arduous than I had imagined. If only my body wasn't like this. Tiffany, I'm sorry. Mother-in-law began to apologize more. The most frustrating was mother-in-law herself, unable to move freely. My husband became more irritable after we started living together. Mom, please be strong. No, that's not it! My husband was cooperative with mother-in-law's care, but knowing how lively mother-in-law used to be, perhaps he felt frustrated and his tone towards her grew harsher. Daniel, be kinder to Ellen. Lately, you've been a bit scary, you know? Daniel looked puzzled for a moment, then said, Yeah, you're right. Sorry. After a day's work, coming home to care for mother-in-law was tough. We had a helper during the day, but at night there were times I'd be woken up for trips to the bathroom. It was a strain. Gradually, the conversations between my husband and me lessened. Tiffany, are you and Daniel doing okay lately? I shouldn't be one to talk. 3 years after mother-in-law fell ill, I quit my job. Honestly, I was at my physical limit. Around this time, my husband started coming home late, finding excuses. Brother-in-law seemed to stop by occasionally while we were out, probably to ask for money. Well, things aren't going great, but maybe that's just how it is with couples. I managed a weak smile, and mother-in-law apologized tearfully, lamenting her useless son. She told me it was okay, and to divorce Daniel if I ever felt it was too much. My husband happily accepted my resignation from work. Perhaps he thought this meant he was completely off the hook for caregiving. The more time I spent with mother-in-law, the more we talked. We ate together, watched TV, and even planned a trip for when it got warmer. It's still cold now. Let's go when it warms up a bit. I would come to deeply regret these words. Mother-in-law's cancer had come back. The doctor said it wasn't for life extension, but to be prepared. Afterward, mother-in-law was in and out of the hospital and seldom came home. As for my husband, he said, "We need to talk properly about money, inheritance, things like that with David." After that, all he talked about was money. Such a low point. He's barely taken care of her recently. By this time, I felt no love for my husband. A few months later, on a warm day, mother-in-law passed away. She was only 64 years old. The funeral was a small family affair, as mother-in-law had wished. Oddly, some relatives glared at me, though we hadn't met much. Why are they looking at me like that? As I stood there bewildered, someone said, "Daniel's wife. What was it? Right, Tiffany. Long time no see." Despite the funeral, a very cheerful brother-in-law had shown up. "David?" I glared at him with all the disgust I could muster. "Oh, scary," he reacted. Just as I was about to snap, brother-in-law and my husband were surrounded by relatives. "You've had a tough time with all those years of caregiving. Good job." My husband and brother-in-law, teary-eyed, claimed they had done their best for 5 years. I heard from Daniel that his wife wasn't much help. He could only support financially. Sorry about that. The relatives looked at me as if I were something unpleasant. Ah, I see. Both brothers are truly the worst. Noticing my stare, my husband and brother-in-law looked worried, as if it were bad to be overheard. "No. Well, I reached my breaking point at their irresponsible laughter. "Ha! These two providing care? They've hardly been home recently. How dare you say that? Are you stupid?" My outburst stirred the relatives. "What's going on? Your story doesn't match up. Let's hear the full story, Tiffany." It was mother-in-law's brother who approached me. I remembered my husband once said that he was quite intimidating when angry. Brother-in-law and my husband both seemed to dread him, the most formidable among the relatives. Daniel was cooperative with caregiving at first, but gradually he became harsher with his mother. And in the end, he hardly took care of her at all. To my words, the relatives glared at my husband with a gasp. In a panic, my husband said, Wait! No, that's not right! Everything she's saying is a lie! Believe me!" Most of the relatives looked at my husband with a cold gaze. Then there's David over there. He's the scum who came asking for money on the day of Ellen's crucial surgery. As my revelations continued, the relatives' faces filled with anger as they looked at the two men. They fell silent, my husband looking like he was about to cry. "Tiffany, may I have a word with you, actually?" After hearing Uncle Mike's story, I trembled with anger. After mother-in-law fell ill, my husband and brother-in-law started visiting relatives' houses, saying, "Actually, we're in a bit of a financial bind, with medical expenses and various other costs." It turned out they had been lying and receiving money. When the relatives said they would visit soon, my husband, perhaps afraid his lie would be exposed, said, "The thing is, my wife gets angry when strangers, even if they're relatives, comes into our home. She's not very cooperative with Mom's care. We're really struggling." And that's how my husband supposedly lied. What is that? I would have wanted everyone to visit Ellen. The relatives looked down in response to my words. In the silent room, brother-in-law suddenly said, well, don't worry, Uncle Mike. We'll pay back the money. We had no intention to deceive. Right, Daniel? Irritated by this despicable brother-in-law, caught off guard, my husband said, Huh? Oh yeah, things got a bit mixed up, but we didn't deceive anyone. Really, the money was used for medical expenses. We'll pay it back when we get the insurance money from Mom. He made an utterly despicable remark. Mom raised us brothers with unconditional love. We're truly grateful. As my husband and brother-in-law pretended to be tearful, I reached my limit of anger. I reached into my pocket for the voice recorder and played it at maximum volume. Everyone, please listen to this. Both of you go to hell. Immediately after my voice, Mom, lend me some money. The voice echoed, and everyone had a shocked expression. Is that voice Daniel? The relatives' gaze instantly focused on my husband. My husband had an awkward look on his face. Daniel, you were calling David the worst, but you were also asking Ellen for money, huh? Until I heard the voice recorder, I embarrassingly didn't know my husband had been demanding money from mother-in-law. What? Demand? That's not it. I just borrowed a little. My husband outrageously lost his temper. Seeing my husband making excuses about needing money for work, I looked at him dispassionately. I continued playing the recorder without care. From now on, I'll manage Mom's bank account. It'd be trouble if David found out. Hearing my husband's voice from the recorder, brother-in-law raised his voice. Hey, Daniel! What's this about? My husband stood alone, sweating. Could you explain that in more detail? My husband was sweating alone. Can you explain that in more detail? Asked my husband's uncle. I handed him the voice recorder without a word. Each playback brought the voices of my husband and brother-in-law demanding money from mother-in-law, sometimes even uttering abuses. At this rate, you can't even use the money with such a body! Even after mother-in-law's fall, their attitude remained unchanged. After the playback finished, after the recording was played through, sit down, both of you! Mike, my husband's uncle, was visibly angry. My husband and brother-in-law were trembling, perhaps out of fear. Then, my parents, who had been silent until now, spoke up. We apologize, but we will take our leave now. We cannot burden our daughter any further. We've told her many times to come back home, yet she stayed because of her concern for Ellen. Daniel, I have no intention of forgiving you. Tears came to my eyes at my father's words. Just discuss it among yourselves, said my father, as he led my mother and me away from the funeral. I felt sorry for not being there for mother-in-law's last moments, but I had no regrets, as I had spent plenty of time talking with mother-in-law during her life. I found the voice recorder in mother-in-law's room shortly before she passed. I didn't know what it was meant for, but perhaps mother-in-law had foreseen all this. That's what I thought when I heard the last words on the recorder. Poor Tiffany. The recording started with mother-in-law's kind voice, filled with gratitude and memories for me. I also learned that my husband and brother-in-law had been caught for theft and arrested in the past. I gave them money rather than have them cause trouble for others, she said in a sad voice. My husband's father, the late father-in-law, had been a terribly awful man, with a bad drinking habit and a fondness for gambling. Mother-in-law suffered a lot because of him. She said she felt relieved when he passed away. I thought my life would end just like that, but thanks to Tiffany, I was able to enjoy my last days. I am really grateful. Thank you. But I put Tiffany through a lot of hard times, didn't I? Thank you for marrying my foolish son, Daniel, and I'm sorry. Tears streamed down my face as I listened to mother-in-law's words on the recorder. Despite opposition from my friends and parents, I was grateful for the happy times I spent with mother-in-law. Afterward, my divorce from my husband was finalized. Later, Mike came to visit me at my parents' house. He apologized to me and my parents, and I heard that my ex-husband and former brother-in-law were now in prison. My parents were surprised, but I wasn't. It didn't seem implausible for those two despicable men. Afterward, the two brothers turned on each other, throwing blame. "Our family has caused you great trouble," Mike said, looking exhausted. The former husbands had apparently started a commotion, and the funeral staff had called the police. When the police arrived, perhaps due to their guilty conscience, they caused even more chaos. It was then discovered they were both being charged with fraud and were arrested. They were utterly despicable. Mike informed me that the funeral had concluded without further incident. It might seem strange for me to say this, but please come to visit the grave if you can. Ellen was very grateful for everything Tiffany did for her. Thank you so much. He expressed his thanks to me. Seeing Mike like that, I said, "Of course, I am also grateful to Ellen." Mother-in-law had changed her life insurance policy to make me the beneficiary. It was something I had not been informed about at all, so it was a real surprise. Before I knew it, I had turned 40. I considered looking for a new job, but then I thought about using my savings from before I was married, along with the money mother-in-law left me, to try opening a small cafe. I want to create a place where visitors can take a warm and relaxing break.